You're very welcome to the programme.
Hi, so good to be here.
Well, and before we talk about the brand new album, let me ask you very briefly about the song we've just been listening to, Headlights Look Like Diamonds. It was written by yourself and Regine on your first date, is that true?
It is true.
What do you remember from that writing session?
My friend Josh and I that I started Arcade Fire with, I just moved to Montreal, and we would go hang out at the jazz school. We're trying to find a drummer, as bands are always trying to find a drummer. And so this was like year 2 of trying to find a drummer. So we would go hang out at the music school outside the drummer rooms and just trying to listen to hear people practice. And Regine saw us. We're both 6'5" in the like kind of classical and jazz department, and looked pretty sketchy. Like we just not sketchy. We just looked like we clearly were not studying jazz or classical music. And we were totally just eating in the cafeteria, just like pretending that we went there, even though it was pretty obvious we didn't. And so she sort of caught me, and she's like, and I saw her, she looked really kind of, had a very unique way of dressing. I went up to her and described the band, and I think she was a little bit skeptical. But yeah, I probably said something like, we're really into like the Pixies and New Order and classical music, and we're looking for a drummer. And she could tell I was serious, I think, but she, whatever, she was a little bit skeptical. So I got her number, and then I saw her singing. Coincidentally, I saw her singing at a art opening like a few days later, and she was just doing jazz, like a jazz set with a piano player. And I went up to her and I was like, seriously, we have to play music. So she came over to my apartment, and I played her some songs, and she could tell that I was not messing around and that I was pretty serious. And I remember she brought a couple instruments, and she had this little music box, like, like a children's music box you could give to a kid that has like made of plastic, and it's like a little, you spin it up, and it was, it's a small world after all. The lyrics were printed on the back, and it's like, it's a world of joy, it's a world of tears. And she was reading the lyrics backwards, like, all after all now we aware, all after all the joy we share, there's so much fears of, like, that whole part of this song was like just sort of like inspired by reading It's a Small World backwards. So that's what I remember from that.
I mentioned in the introduction that this new album speaks to the moment socially and politically, but it strikes me that it also is a very personal album as well. I mean, we spoke about you meeting Regine. To what extent is this album about yourself and Regine?
I think that I'm always like, in some ways singing to myself. It's like, I feel like playing a song like Wake Up, like I feel like I was talking to myself, like my older self when I was a kid. It's like you're singing these songs you wrote when you were in your 20s and still trying to figure out what they're about. I remember seeing Neil Young. We played his benefit, and he was doing Old Man, and just being struck by the fact that he was 22 when he wrote it, and didn't even realize that he was singing it to himself, And then when you see him singing as a 75-year-old, you're like, oh, okay, this is pretty deep.
I want to ask you about the track that opens the album. It's called Age of Anxiety. Where does that title come from?
Well, it's sort of in the back of my head. I didn't even realize this is where it came from, but I saw Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who's a great beat poet, came to read at my high school. He was good friends with my English teacher. And he has a poem called I'm Waiting, but I hadn't heard it since I was 15. I hadn't read it since I was 15. And I found a copy of it at my parents' house that I'd stolen from my high school library. And I was leafing through it, and I found the poem, and I was like, oh, that's the one he read. And as I was reading it, I got to the stanza, and he says, I'm waiting for the age of anxiety to drop dead. And I just started crying because it was so in my subconscious, like it was just had been sort of bouncing around in the back of my head since I was 15, but I didn't consciously know where it came from.
Closes with a line, something like, I'm waiting for a renaissance of wonder, which I think is an amazing phrase as well. But let's hear it. This is Arcade Fire and Age of Anxiety. Show tonight by Butler from Arcade Fire. There's something really strange about this album in the sense that it does speak to what we have experienced collectively over the course of the last 2 years, even though the songs themselves, I think in large part, were written before the pandemic, before any of this stuff. So in a sense, there's almost this foreshadowing.
I mean, I think musicians, it's like you have an antenna you kind of have up. Like music comes from a very mysterious place. It's almost like you're just turning this little radio dial, and it's mostly static. And every once in a while, you pick up this little snippet of something. And so it's like, I think in order to be in a state to write, it's like you have to be very open. And I think that's every once in a while you get some little echoes from the future as well as echoes from the past.
It was being written, but also recorded in a very tumultuous time. I remember around the week of the US presidential elections, in the middle of all the news stories, one story was that you were recording the album. I'm just wondering, did that week and did the insurrection that followed sharpen what you wanted to say in certain parts of this record?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I feel like sometimes with my lyrics, it's like people are like, why is this guy so mad at the internet or whatever the hell? And it's like I'm really just trying to raise my hand and say, like, this is all great. All of this modern crap we have is amazing. But, there's a couple red flags that I'd like to raise about we said these giant corporations just sort of farming us for content and farming us for, what we spend our money on. And it's all great and it's convenient but it's like, I'm just a human and I have a son who's 9 and I'm just, every once in a while, I like to say it's not all awesome.
There's a lovely moment in End of the Empire 4. Well, it's actually a refrain repeated throughout the song, but you use the phrase, I unsubscribe. And there's something amazingly powerful about the phrase, I unsubscribe in 2022. It packs a punch.
Well, you're trying. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm trying to unsubscribe and it doesn't work. It's like keep clicking the button. It's like, no, I don't want any more articles about the Kardashians. Like, I'm good. Like, no more. What's the button I press for no more articles ever? That button. Give me that one.
I think that button has passed. The two sides of the album are named I and We. I love that. I and We instead of A and B. So what is happening in those two parts? What is happening inside I and what is happening inside We?
I think the I side I think there's two aspects to We. It's like there's sort of this collective anxiety and, it's like, I think humans love pitchforks and going to burn down castles. And what's the line that Bono always says about Ireland? It's like Americans see a castle on the hill and say, one day I'm going to live in that house. And Irish people see a castle on the hill and say, one day I'm going to burn that to the ground. So it's like, the first side of the collective side was like, we're going to burn this thing to the ground. And it's like the ways in which we hold each other back and kind of cut each other down and find something negative in everything positive. And, it's this desire to escape oneself ultimately. It's like, I know I get sick of the voices in my head and just, you kind of want to escape from yourself. And then I was reading about the discovery of Sagittarius A star, which is the black hole in the middle of our galaxy, and just thinking that there's this black hole at the center of everything. And so it sort of became this image in my head of like, well, maybe if this character could escape through this black hole, then that's far enough away from all of this. And then once they reach there, they sort of find their own I and they find themselves, and there's really nothing to escape from because we're sort of all in this together. And, you sort of find we all literally come from the same mother. We're all genetically related, and it's this web of humanity that stretches back to the beginning of our kind. So it's like it's sort of both sides of it.
The first thing that we heard from the album was The Lightning, and there's a real sense of euphoria as that song gathers pace. Tell us a little bit about it just before we hear it.
Well, we were in West Texas, in El Paso, peak COVID. El Paso was the worst city in America for COVID, and they were using prison inmates to move the bodies to the morgues. It was really heavy time. It was a U.S. election, and the property we were staying on was at the Mexican border with the Trump border wall, literally ended on the property. So you could walk to see where they hadn't finished building the wall yet, and it's just open desert all the way to Mexico. And literally, as we were finishing the takes of The Lightning, we heard that Trump had lost the election. So it's pretty much baked in there because it was just this major crossroads, and you're like, this movie could really get dark. What direction is this thing going to go? So I think, but it was also sort of the realization that even if we woke up the next day and Trump had won, we'd still have to put on our work boots and like even more than ever, you still have to fight, and you still have to, they're trying to overturn Roe versus Wade in the United States right now, which has been law for 50 years. And so it's like there's still a fight and a fight for humanity. And so like, even if you lose, you still have to show up and fight.
Let's hear the lightning right now. This is Arcade Fire. Arcade Fire is with me tonight on the program. Throughout your career, there have been numerous religious references on your records. I mean, Neon Bible being one of the biggest ones, because it refers to a book which, talks about evangelical America. I mean, Unconditional Race and Religion on this record too. What is your relationship with religion?
Well, I kind of grew up half, my mom's family is Mormon, like way back. My dad's family is like Harvard agnostic, like East Coast people. But my mom's family were like jazz musicians. I called them Martini Mormons. Like they smoked cigarettes and like my grandpa played with like Duke Ellington and was like a pretty hip cat. So it was like I was exposed, but like being in Texas and being kind of half Mormon, you almost feel like you're like not at all Christian. It's like people really treat you like you're like a total weirdo freak. But I got like the mega church thing in the US really, it started in Houston, like the giant television preacher. So I saw that sort of stuff and I began to associate it with just insincerity. It's like when you hear these guys talk and they kind of do the thing where their voice is breaking and there's like, oh, and I really have a message for you. And it's always right before they hand out the thing to get the money. It's always like, and now we're going to please donate. It's like, it always had, so I just began to associate it with like complete and total insincerity. And yet, whenever I went to art school and everything I studied, like everything related back to the Bible in some way, it's like all literature up until the 1960s. It's like, there's obviously this really deep and interesting and kind of beautiful message. And it's a very complicated book. So I ended up studying, I have a degree in religious studies and Russian literature actually was my minor. So it's really light reading.
And there's this sense of gospel euphoria about your music at times as well.
I mean, honestly, for me, church at this, I don't really go to church, but if I do, the music better be amazing. Because particularly in New Orleans, one time we stumbled, it was like a Sunday, we were walking around and I heard the most beautiful, like full on proper gospel music. And we just stumbled into this church and the tambourines and just like, I believe, let's go. So I don't know. I mean, to me, music is really close to the divine.
You start your world tour in Dublin's 3 Arena on the 30th of August. What does it mean to you to be kicking things off in Ireland?
Dublin. Oh my God. I'm like a little bit scared already for the show. It's going to be terrifyingly awesome. I mean, still the first time we ever played in Ireland is seared in my consciousness when people were singing Wake Up. Like we were planning on ending the show with Wake Up, but people were singing Wake Up for like an hour before we went on stage. First time we ever played in Ireland. And it was like, I feel like this is going to be a deep relationship that we have with this place. So it really does feel like the perfect place, particularly for the thematics of the record. And, in a lot of ways, Dublin feels like a hometown show for us.
We can't wait to see you here. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining.